second.
Can you talk about Trump?
We believe that there's two reasons why this talk is important. We'll very briefly point that out to you. The first reason when we decided to have this talk about populism is that when you open the newspaper today, turn on the television, hear something on the radio, read something on the internet, whatever it is, populism is a very often mentioned, referenced kind of topic or word. To some extent, populism, or at least the visibility of populism in itself, is kind of becoming everywhere. It's transpassing national boundaries. One of my colleagues who works at the Google Analytics department found out from me that populism is actually in the top 50 of the most searched, increasingly searched items since 2010 on the internet. That is, if you take out things like Kim Kardashian, etc. So, socially relevant topics. The second reason why we think that this talk is kind of important is because most of the times when you do hear populism mentioned or you read about it, it's mostly cited or referenced in a very negative way. There's only very few people or few politicians who would take being called a populist as a compliment. There are some. Those are certainly the minority. So, very few people actually consider it a normatively desired topic. Unlike any other topic or concept in political science, really, populism is still kind of highly contested. We know quite a lot about populism, what it is, defined, etc., but in the end, we know very little about populism. And in the end, this talk is probably not going to make you populism experts, and that's certainly also not our intention. But we do hope to contribute something to your general perception of what the concept means, what it can do, how it can influence politics, society, democracy, etc. And we figured, who better to do this than an expert in the field. So for that reason, we thought it quite appropriate to invite Dr. Hawkins to give this lecture for us. Dr. Hawkins is an associate professor at Brigham Young University in the United States. He obtained his PhD from Duke University under a tutelage of Robert Kitchell, and his PhD was on party system breakdown, both in Venezuela and Mexico. Since then, he has received many awards. He has continued his populism research through many book chapters and peer-reviewed articles, including 2 books called Venezuela's Chavismo and Populism in Comparative Perspective, and Latin American Party Systems, both published by Cambridge University Press. Since 2014, Dr. Hawkins is also the director, founder, developer of a group of researchers called Team Populism, which he will surely mention in a little bit. And it brings together basically a large amount of renowned scholars across the world, both the Americas and Europe, that study populism and try to figure out what its causes and its consequences might be. I'm personally very grateful that Dr. Hawkins accepted this invitation, not only because I consider him to be quite the expert in the field, but also because I think he promotes and initiates kind of collaborative and original research in a topic, like I said, that still needs quite a bit of attention. So without much further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Kurt Hawkins, who will talk for about an hour, and then we will open the floor for some questions.
I should say, sí sé hablar español, y después quiero hacer pero Steven me ha dicho que tengo que dar esto en inglés. So I wanted to thank Steve for that kind introduction and let you know that he's a member of Team Populism, and it is great that I'm happy to be working with fine scholars like Professor Van Hom. I also want to give you special thanks for having me here. It's been, we're trying to aside, I think about 13 years since I was last here at CDA. I came here first as a graduate student working on my doctorate dissertation. And I've always admired CDA for the excellence of its faculty and students. And I am grateful for the home it provided me when I was working on my dissertation so many years ago. It's nice to see some decent change, but also something to say. So I am here to help explain Trump to you. To help explain Donald Trump, I want you to realize that Trump isn't entirely unique. As Professor Van Howard suggested, there's this thing called populism. Let me help us understand it. Trump is connected to some other important events that have happened this past year. Brexit, the constitutional referendum in Italy, the post-coup purge in Turkey. In Latin America, we can think about the breakdown of the state in Venezuela, a real tragedy. Those have all been called populists at some point, and I'm here to say that that's true, that they all have some populism in them, and that calling them populism helps us if we define that carefully. We need to know what that word means so that we can try to study these things scientifically. And that's really what the team populism is about, is this effort to scientifically study the causes and consequences of populism. And in the process, then I think that helps us understand what's happening. We can understand why people voted for Trump. It also can provide some policy insights. And for team populism, it's very important to do scientific work. It also might tell us something about what we could do as citizens, as activists. And I'll end my talk today with some thought-provoking policy suggestions. So I'm going to talk about these items. I'm going to first define populism, then I'm going to show you some data that can measure populism. In case you're not persuaded that it's important, I'll tell you some of its consequences. Then we'll get the thing that I like as a social scientist to talk about its causes. We'll present a theory to help us understand why people vote for populists. And then finally, talk about its policy implications. Now, what is populism? I find that it's helpful, especially in an audience like this. We're in Latin America. You've already learned something about populism. You actually use the word in Spanish frequently, much more than in the United States, where people just discovered this word. And so it helps if I say how I do not define populism. So I don't see populism, I don't define it in older structuralist terms. This would be some work of Latin American sociologists from the mid-20th century, where they saw populism as a phase of late modernization, especially of Latin American countries, but a few others in the developing world. They associated it with import substituting industrialization, so economic development policies, and also cross-class coalitions. I've not defined populism that way. There are many instances of populism that don't fit that definition at all. I also don't define it in economic terms. I don't know how many of you here are maybe economic students and professors. In economics, it's commonly defined populism as an approach to macroeconomic policy that sacrifices long-term growth for short-term gains. Now, it's true some populists do that, but many don't. There are right-wing populists that don't fit that description, even in Latin America occasionally. So I also don't use the strategic institutional definition. This is a newer one that some of my Latin American colleagues use. And this emphasizes organizational or institutional features. It defines populism as an anti-establishment movement led by a charismatic outsider. So it focuses more on how it's organized and tends to see the ideas that motivate the leaders as fit and necessary. Now, all these definitions do have something in common. If you went back and looked at some of the original work by Torquato Videla or Kurt Whelan, who looked at Owen Bush and Edwards, You see in their definitions, they all also mention something about the anti-establishment, pro-people talk or discourse or rhetoric of these populists. And that is precisely what a number of scholars are now focusing on, say, like populism. So they define populism in terms of ideas. I use the word ideation here as a way of not offending people who want to use slightly different words. So I prefer calling it a discourse or discursive framework. Stephen was calling it a thin-centered ideology. And others call it style. The idea of all of these is that populism is ultimately a set of ideas. It's something that people think and say. It's measurable, I would say. Specifically, I'll use the word discourse here. It's a discourse in which people, citizens, or politicians talk about and see democratic politics as a struggle between the will of common people and a conspiring evil. Let me say that more loudly. There is a kind of democratic quality to this. Someone who has populists like this thinks that popular sovereignty is good, and ordinary people are capable of making their decisions because of that. Because that agency they have, they deserve to be solid. They should have to say in their politics and otherwise the country. But it is to see the common people as especially important as the bearers of virtue, of what our country should be about. And wants to believe that there's one right way of doing this. It's the way that ordinary people would choose if they only had a chance to get together and talk and think peacefully. So there's going to be one right way to the will of the people. It sees this struggling against the elite, powerful politicians, and economic elite, who are not just accidentally acting against the innocent, but intentionally trying to harm the people for their selfish interests. That's the definition of people. They're working together to harm them. Because it sees politics in these terms, populism, it believes that democracy usually then subverted by the elite taking over the system and the people voices not being heard. And so it calls for systemic change. Call it revolution, liberation, whatever you want. They don't always enact what they say they will do, but they talk about the need for some major transformation of the system because you have to restore and control people. Likewise, because it demonizes the elite, it often takes a painful little attitude towards little democratic institutions, norms of scientific reasoning. It believes people know what's best, people should listen to them, and so if institutions get in the way, we can do away with institutions. So that's the definition. Now, a little bit more I can say about this is in terms of left versus right populism. As I'll emphasize later, populism is sort of an empty shell. So it is a set of ideas and makes some claims. But those claims aren't very specific. Populism will tell you exactly what to do about educational reform or how to rebuild the metro and school cities so it works better. It won't tell you actually about automatic policy and so forth. So populism makes some claims, but those claims and the rest of it have a complete, coherent, comprehensive program. You need to bring in another ideology. So classical ideologies like liberalism, socialism, conservatism help provide the additional content populism is necessary. So usually we have a populist of a certain ideological type. So we can talk about left versus right populists. All right. Talk about the definition. Can we measure this? As we know in science, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So we can measure populist ideas. This fancy graph here.
There would be fancy. See, this is a loss of translation.
I've got a different table I'll show you. There's a beautiful graph. I'll tell you what it is, and when I describe it to you, you'll weep, because it would be so interesting to see. What the graph does is we analyze the speeches and the debate performance. We did a textual analysis of all of the U.S. presidential candidates. So Trump, Clinton, and all the others. Across the entire campaign, started with their opening speech and then ended with just two candidates, able to show you very nicely then the course of the discourse, the popular discourse over the campaign. We summarize some of those results, and I'll show you the summary because not only does this analysis like us compare the candidates to each other, but we're measuring this across countries, looking at other parties in the years. So this. So this shows you a comparison of average scores of the candidates in the U.S. and alongside Spain, looking at right around the time of their election in January 2015, and then Venezuela at the time of their special by-election to choose a new president after Chavez died. And with all of these, we look at a similar sample of speeches, debate performance, and party platform. And we're able to analyze all of these with some precision. Each one is read by two coders that very good recorded reliability. And the scores here come from zero. And what you should see as you look here is, in fact, the U.S., even in this presidential campaign, Trump himself, is not like Venezuela. So it's not as bad as it could be. Venezuela is extremely populous, and it's interesting to see it's not just Nicolas Maduro, the successor of Chavez, that the Venezuelans also incorporated populist discourse into the elections. Not the cases of other cases. Very, very close to the maximum 2.0 Venezuela. In the U.S., on the other hand, we see quite similar to Spain. Trump is a lot like Podemos. Now, that's the party you thought it was populist. You're right, it is moderately populist, but it's not as bad as it could be. Within Spain, we can see a little stronger populism. If you look at the traditional leftist coalition from the other Ecuador, they come a little closer to the Venezuelan standard. In the U.S., Trump is not the most populist. Bernie Sanders is actually more populist, more consistent, strongly populist in his speeches. Now, admittedly, he didn't speak about the entire campaign, something about that. Trump continued. The trend we saw with Trump, by the way, is that he started out not very populist at all. And he got more populist as time went by, and occasionally he slips up and doesn't say anything populist at all. We saw this mostly in his debates with Hillary Clinton. He just doesn't use any populist. Now, this, by the way, suggests that a lot of Trump's discourse is in fact a product of his speech writers, who I think are very well aware of the potential impact of his discourse. Sanders, I suspect, is probably more sincere about this. And in these cases, there's actually a lot of sincerity. So when I used to hear Chavez speak, I didn't think these were speech writers. Most of his speaking was actually civilians. So it seemed pretty sincere. But with Trump, there's that lingering down. Let me show you another score from Trump that was interesting. We broke this down into some subcategories. And so with Trump, he is pretty strong throughout the speeches. He's talking about the establishment, inspiring the lead. But the will of the people is something that he doesn't talk about very well. And especially in his early speeches, he doesn't mention it at all. What does he mention instead? Himself. So that's a bit of what we can look at in terms of data. We can measure populism. And we've done so. And what I like about this is you have to see this from a comparative perspective. To say, well, I may not like Trump. It could be a lot. All right. When we measure it, this is in case you didn't think populism was important. Now, what I've already said might make you think that maybe populism, I told you that populism comes in combination with other ideologies. Those ideologies fill out and give substance to the platform of these politicians. So to a point, what Trump is wanting to do may not reflect populism, it may just reflect this particular ideology. So why does populism matter? And there are a couple of answers. The short one is that populism probably does interact with ideology. At some degree, it probably sharpens or radicalizes issue positions. So, in other words, another conservative candidate in the U.S. probably wouldn't be as radically opposed to immigration as Trump is. So populism may be doing that. As a quick note, if you care about political philosophy, especially ideology, libertarianism, true classic liberalism, is almost entirely incompatible. Libertarians don't like the idea of homogenous people, like the idea of individuals having communities. In the United States, there's a Koch foundation, Koch brothers, infants, radical right-wing industrialists, trying to screen the world activity, absolutely test Donald Trump because they're libertarian. All right, but there's another reason why populism matters a lot, and that is it has a very consistent impact on democracy. Specifically, think about it this way: populism is a little contradictory. It's born in a belief in democracy, popular sovereignty, and up to a point, populism actually draws on liberal ideas about individual agency, how that gives us the right to be sovereign. But populism also grows impatient and mistrustful of liberal institutions like civil liberties, horizontal accountability, or electoral fairness. It's suspicious, for example, of minority rights, because often these minority rights is just being a cloak for the elite, a way for them to entrench themselves in power, because the elite is a minority. So it's willing to cut back on these minority rights, especially if it's going to harm the elite and power. It thinks that institutions matter less than the will of the people, especially when they conflict. And when populism movement centers on a charismatic outsider, when people come to lead bodies their will, better perhaps than the noisy Congress that obviously is doing too much, populism encourages the centralization of power in the chief executive, so it undermines checks and balances and horizontal accountability. We have some results that show just how it does this, but first I wanted to say also populism is a little tricky, and you should feel ambivalence with populism, because it probably also has a positive impact on democratic participation. So we talk about a lot, especially by left-wing fans of populism. So theorists such as Ernesto Cloud and others associated with the Essex School, they have some faith that populism will actually motivate participation by those who are kept outside of the political system. And there are a couple of reasons why it might do this. But one of the main ones is that populists do make an effort, especially left-wing populists, go out and make an effort to mobilize people that they support and believe in. And many of these individuals, people Latin Americans, people, for example, in the informal sector, these people do not vote. They're very politically inactive. Populism should probably get them to speak more. It could also incorporate things like direct institutions of direct democracy, that's happening like Chavez implemented, things like the presidential recall into the Constitution, even if the current government doesn't want to use that feature. So let me show you these results, where we actually look at these empirically, so we can take our data and show you all these relations between them. This is exciting, isn't it? All right. So what this graph shows you very faintly, but just faint enough that you can't see it. This line on that graph shows you the average marginal impact of populist discourse on electoral quality, the fairness of elections, so there's a level playing field. What you see here is that it has an increasing negative impact as the number of terms in office increases. So if you have a populist who's in office for more than one term, we expect to see the quality of elections go down. Another example here, civil liberties. We see a similar graph if we look at press freedom, specific importance of it. It dropped precipitously as populists are in office. More than one term. One term we might not see anything, but as we're the longer the average impact of populism is a lot. So that's an example of populism's negative impact on liberal institutions. This shows you, again, faint, doesn't have to see the effect. This shows you the marginal impact of populist discourse on voter turnout. All these are, by the way, samples of about 100 leaders across Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe, a little bit of interaction. positive effect in voter turnout. Only what ideology moving forward, all populists are center or left ideology. If they have a right wing ideology, then their impact on turnout is basically zero. If you think about this, this actually makes sense now in the U.S. election. So Trump actually didn't increase turnout overall during his election. He made it sound like he did, and there were a few states. You might ask yourself, how do you win the election? And if you don't already know, the shame on you, you see what this group is. The answer is Hillary Clinton got even fewer votes than Barack Obama. And that is what happened. So, I hope I've impressed upon you with one populism has to offer. Very consistent, important effect on democratic institutions. So you might think, does populism go all the way? Does it end up as a fully autocratic regime? The answer is generally no. It seems to be, because at least these days, populists take seriously this idea of populism. They want to be able to say that they have the voting people. They want to say that people who are saying something. Kind of delegated democratic quality to it. The result is they'll maintain elections and have some potential, some competition law. Okay. I'm going to offer now a theory. This is a cutting edge theory. But I want to impress on you the kind of variation you see as we look even across Latin America. So you might think, well, populism is everywhere in Latin America. But then you should stop yourself and say, no way, this haven't seen populism in Mexico for a long time. Yeah. Some Latin American countries have a great deal of not just Venezuela today, but Ecuador.
But likewise, if we're looking at Europe and we see new populists emerging, we wonder what explains that variation. So here's the cutting edge theory. This is going to start with the idea of populist attitudes. Now, we're measuring these in surveys, the idea that individual citizens carry within them some of these same populist ideas. So it's not just something that elites say, political elites, politicians, but that ordinary citizens have these. Each one of you has a little Hugo Chavez inside of you. Think about it. And now that might vary a little bit, especially as you get a college education, you're less likely to have that Hugo Chavez inside of you. So education seems to dampen it. Sometimes we see differences in age within countries. But overall, we find that there are very high levels of populist attitudes across all the countries where we look. Now, Professor Van Howard here is actually doing some very good work looking at different measures, different item inventories for surveys that get at this. What I'm showing you here are results from just one of these inventories, a series of 6 different populist-sounding phrases, and this tracks how much people agree or disagree with these. Again, nearly invisible, but what you're seeing here are 2 sets of columns because we're looking at 2 countries. One of these countries is Greece, and in Greece, you would say, this makes sense. There are populists right now in government. Lots of people are voting for populists. The other country is Chile. They're exactly the same. Populist attitudes are prevalent in both countries across their populations. Now again, we might think that the levels are a little lower or higher depending on the inventory, but what an interesting finding. So populist attitudes are everywhere. And we don't just see this here, but we also see it in the US, we see it in Belgium, we see it in the Netherlands, we see it in a number of European countries that Professor Van Howard has looked at with some of his work. So that's an important fact. Another important fact is that, again, a slightly visible graph, the attitudes are connected to people's votes. They're connected to political behavior. This first graph, well, both of these graphs I'm going to show you come from an exit poll that we conducted in the state of Utah, where I live. This ended up being an important state in the U.S. presidential election. Normally, it is entirely uninteresting because 75% of the people in Utah are Republican. It's one of the most Republican states in the country. But in this election, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction among the Republicans with Donald Trump, and a third-party candidate emerged, an independent. who ended up getting nearly 25% of the vote as well. So it suddenly became an interesting election. We ran this exit poll in the state, and we looked at a couple things. One is we tested to see whether authoritarian attitudes explained the vote for Trump. There was a lot of talk about this in the US, in the blogosphere, among some political scientists, some Americanists who said authoritarian attitudes explain this. We tracked that. We looked, and here in Utah at least, authoritarian attitudes only explain a little bit of what's going on. So the one line here, and this, by the way, is hot off the presses, which is why I haven't labeled anything in this graph. So let's look here. This line, this is the vote for Trump. So the likelihood of voting for Trump, the probability, and this says authoritarian attitudes, as they increase, there's a little positive correlation with the vote for Trump. As we look at either Hillary or this third-party candidate, someone named Evan McMullen, and there's a much weaker association there. So maybe a little bit. Here's the graph for populism. Populist attitudes measured using an index very similar to the one I just showed you for Chile and Greece, a much stronger association. Now these are after controlling for a host of other indicators that we normally use in a vote choice model. So we see again, not only do we have this strong positive association with the vote for Trump, but a negative relationship with the vote for these other candidates. That's very satisfying. That says, okay, second fact, populist attitudes exist, but they also matter for behavior. But now we have a puzzle, which is many people, if they have these attitudes everywhere, and if these attitudes are associated with voting for populists, why don't people vote for populists all the time? We think the answer is that the attitudes have to be activated. So they lie latent, dormant most of the time. The Chavez inside of you is sleeping. But something can wake him up. What things would wake up Chavez? Now, we think there are a series of factors that matter. For example, the availability of credible leaders in a movement that can embody that message. But the other thing, one of the things that we think is most decisive is a context of failed democratic representation. What do I mean by that? By this, I mean more than just a policy failure. So an economic recession or significant increases in income inequality or an influx of immigrants, as bad as those things can be, as unsettling as they might be, they alone will not cause people to vote for populists. What else does it need? It requires that those problems, those policy failures, be due to the willful actions of the political elite. So a massive failure of democratic government to do its job is not only happening, they're not only policy failures, but it's happening not just because of outside circumstances that we couldn't avoid, and it's not happening because the elite is just incompetent and making some mistakes, but we have a very clear sense that they actually created this intentionally. And even worse, if they did it for selfish reasons. In other words, the populist message is right. Now, the most common situation where this is going to happen is a polity with a great deal of corruption, systemic, widespread corruption among all the parties. Countries that have this are where we see the most radical forms of populism the most frequently. Think of Venezuela, think of Ecuador, think of Argentina. But that doesn't mean that populism can't happen in a place like Western Europe or even the United States. But we expect it to happen to a little lesser degree. But what might be the cause there? We can imagine not so corrupt politicians just getting out of touch with their voters enough that they flaunt the wishes of their voters. They ignore them. They might not be corrupt exactly, but they're ignoring them, and they kind of know. Let me give you an example of how this can happen. Let's think about economic globalization. This is a good thing. Free trade is good for all of us. In the long run, it can improve the economy for most people, but there are losers too. And if the politicians ignore those losers in order to benefit their other constituents, the losers might start to feel like they've been betrayed because policies that have been intentionally enacted are actually hurting them, and no one's paying attention to them. Imagine now that that's happening, that the losers constitute the majority of the population, and that there's a lot of corruption. That would be Venezuela in the late 1990s. The results there are devastating. What if instead this is the United States? I think in the US we would say that there are more winners from losers, more winners than losers from globalization. So we would expect that a highly radical populist wouldn't come to power. He wouldn't be able to win. But maybe a little more moderate populist would have this idea that if he runs inside of a traditional party in a two-party system and then wins the nomination, he'll have the backing of the angry voters who have active populist attitudes and the other voters in his party who just don't like their opponent. Well, that, of course, is what happened in the US. So if Trump, the implication here is important, if Trump had been more radical, like Hugo Chavez, or if he had run outside the party system, he would probably not have won the election. Just to emphasize that, now I'm going to remind you that Trump is not the first time populism has appeared in the US. Populism is a recurring phenomenon in the US. Every 15 or 20 years, we have third-party movements that speak populism. So if you're a little older like me, you'll remember Ross Perot and United We Stand in the early 1990s. That was a populist movement. If you're older than me, I don't think anyone in here, I'm going to see one or two, but I won't point to you. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. You might remember George Wallace in the late 1960s, another populist movement. We could go back. We go back to the 1920s and the 1910s and think of the progressive movements. They were very populist. The Populist Party of the 1890s was very populist. The Know Nothing movement was populist. Jacksonian democracy, wow, America's had a series of these, haven't they? So why don't they win? Because the most radical movements don't gain a lot of traction. They sound a little too crazy. And most of the time, they're offended by the system enough that they won't run inside the existing parties, and so they don't win. That's usually been the case in America. So what you're seeing right now is a particular moment when you had a smart populist. All right, let's talk about policy implications. So here my question is, what could be done in Mexico, for example, or in the United States, maybe to prevent this kind of thing? If you're from Mexico right now, you should maybe even have a little fear in you. You should say, it sounds like we could have populists here. Why don't we yet? What would it take? What do I need to keep the worst situation from happening? All right, now I won't go too far into what probably interests you most right now. You probably want to know, how do you respond once you have a populist living next door to you in the country just to the north? And I'm going to tell you, this is actually a very difficult thing to talk about, because the answer depends on how strong the support for that populist is. Highly radical populists, so not Trump, but someone more like Chavez, with very strong domestic support, is not easily moved. This was the experience of Chavez in Venezuela. Nothing budged him. So international pressure meant very little. At home, the opposition had very little leverage on what he did. So it's extremely difficult. Now, that might fill you with some despair. Many Venezuelans have felt that despair. But now, here's a room for a little hope, perhaps. If you have a more moderate populist with weak democratic support, and I think that's true right now of President Trump's support in the U.S., first of all, because they're more moderate, it's less likely that they're going to undermine institutions to the same extent as a Chavez did. But the second point is that they're going to encounter stiffer resistance at home and abroad. And so taking a patient strategy there is much easier. You can probably sit it out. You can continue to treat Trump graciously, even when he says outrageous things. What I want to do, though, is focus on a couple of more interesting and controversial points. The first one especially. And I wanted to point out something that is especially important for this audience, because you consider yourselves sophisticated, you're increasing in your level of education, you probably look down on populists and the rabble that supports them. Yeah. The chusma. And in other words, you are the elite. You are the elite that the populists are talking about. And what I want to tell you, what I want to help you see, is that there's usually a grain of truth, of liberal democratic truth, to the populist complaint. And so here's the advice: respectfully identify and acknowledge the truth within that complaint, but defend your other liberal democratic principles at the same time. Let me give you an example building off of one that I've already done. If we have time, I'll give you a second example that's even more controversial. So the first example is to go back to economic globalization. As I pointed out, with globalization, with free trade, with open markets, with open capital markets, with open labor markets, good things can happen and many people can benefit from that. But there are losers. And those losers are usually aware that the policies that have harmed them like this are not just acts of God or nature. These are the creations of human beings. They intentionally created these policies that are now harming them. And they're also sometimes aware that it would be possible to alleviate their situation and to help them out. In the case of free trade and globalization, economic globalization, we could talk about trade compensation. For example, you could provide them with better education. You could provide remedial education at low cost to allow them to retrain and re-enter the economy. You could do that. You could provide a better social safety net that ensures health care, for example, at a minimum for them. So they know that they would be taken care of and healthy, even if they've lost their job and are having a hard time finding a new one. But you haven't provided those. And so what they see is a set of very privileged people who are going to fine universities, getting excellent educations, and enjoying the benefits of a globalized economy, and they are being systematically left behind. What's happening to them is a violation of basic democratic principles. How is that? They are citizens too. And the government is supposed to exist to help its citizens. And it should be treating them equally before the law. Those principles are very dear to liberal democratic theory. That all citizens would be treated as equals before the law. But with that person who's been fired, is out of a job because the factory moved, what they're seeing is that they are not being treated as equals before the law. So what's the solution? The solution is not to give in and say, well, we're going to get rid of free trade. So what Donald Trump is doing right now is wrong. He's throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as we say. What could you do instead? Well, you could start by saying, you who have been harmed by this are right. You're not being treated as full citizens. And as a government, we do have the capacity to help you, and we should do that. But we're going to keep free trade. We'll have the best of both, because we can do it, and then we'll all benefit. That is the kind of solution, that kind of compromise is feasible. But no one is talking about it right now. Let me give you another example that's trickier, closer to home, and very painful. Brace yourselves. Are you ready for this? Okay. We're going to talk about losers from immigration. Now, this is a little fresher and livelier for me because I come from a state, although I live right now in Utah, and we have a sizable Hispanic population there. I originally come from Arizona, which is on the border with Mexico. And in the city where I live, to give you an example of how this is very real for me, my parents recently moved from our home. I was born and raised in this house in Phoenix. They lived there for 40 years, and then they retired. They moved far away to a much greener, cooler place than Phoenix. I'm very happy for them. I'm also happy because now when I go to visit them, it's not 50 grados in the summertime. But when I've gone back to visit the old home and take my children there, they encounter something very striking. The home is now owned by someone who is an immigrant from Mexico. And she subdivided the house into 4 apartments where other immigrant families live. You might think I feel a little ambivalent when I see what she did to the house, and I know that it's violating zoning laws. But on the other hand, I think she comes from a country that I love and cherish. I feel a little torn inside. Now, the situation for others in, say, a border state like Arizona, imagine you're the rancher who has illegal immigrants crossing his property routinely, cutting down the fence, leaving trash and debris behind, and he has to go in at his own expense, clean it up. And then he hears that those illegal immigrants, when they're caught, are not being deported immediately, but instead, the laws are being held back for a while so that they can stay and have a longer judicial proceeding that might allow them to stay. And he thinks to himself, they don't do that for me. And he's right. The law is probably not being bent in that way to help him. So what he feels, again, the argument is really the same. I'm a citizen, but I'm receiving the same treatment, maybe less fair treatment than someone who is not a citizen. What does my citizenship mean if I'm not going to be treated as equal before the law, or worse? So it appears to them. Now, the solution to that is, again, not to say, give in to bigotry, give in to racism, close the borders and build a wall. The solution is to say, we need immigrants, we value people coming here from other countries, but let's make sure that it is done legally, and that if there's some negative impact it's having on our citizens here, we need to look to that and see, how is this hurting you? We're very sorry. What can we do to make it better? Because you are citizens first, and we need to respect that. So, the lesson here is respectfully identify and acknowledge the truth in the populist complaint. And I think we can do that without letting go of our other democratic principles. Let me also say that that's not what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. The polarized environment in the U.S. is very typical for places where populism has emerged, and it drives us apart. So on one side, they'll call Trump supporters, they'll call them bigots, they'll call them ignorant. And I'm not saying they aren't, but they have a point, and you need to see that point and acknowledge it, and not just dismiss them out of hand. The same goes if you were a free market kind of Republican who doesn't see what's the fuss of all these workers complaining about free trade, which we know is good for us. Again, they have a point, and you need to acknowledge that, and not just label them and demonize them. All right, now last thing to think about, sobering again for Latin America. This chart shows you something we already know from the economists, which is that corruption is probably one of the key impediments to economic development. This chart, this scatter plot, compares the level of corruption measured using the World Bank's Control of Corruption Index. This is for the year 2000. Each dot is a country. On the other axis, this measures per capita GDP for the year 2000, measured in purchasing power parity. If you're seeing what I do right now, you see a very strong linear relationship there. Now, I don't get a lot of linear relationships in the social sciences. I'm very excited to see something like this. This just confirms, though, an argument for economics, which is that one of the key impediments to development is corruption. Why? Because corruption means that the rule of law isn't there, that institutions are not protecting property rights. If property rights aren't protected, people don't invest. They don't invest in themselves. They don't invest in infrastructure. When there's no investment, there's no economic growth. Okay, that's a pretty simple, that's powerful, though. It's especially powerful because I've labeled the Latin American countries on that graph. And it turns out, as you already knew, most of them are not only less developed, but they tend to have a lot of corruption. The exception here is this country right here. It's hard to see that dot. That's Chile. In the years since 2000, how has the graph changed? Chile has moved from there to there. Yeah. Now, this has nothing to do with populism, right? This is exciting. You think, oh, the secret to development is right here. We can take Mexico into the first world if we can only rebuild the state. A small, easy task. But there's a second point for us here as we think about populism. Corruption also, remember I said, mattered for populism. So here we look at the same World Bank index. I should say, by the way, I've reversed the scale here, so high numbers mean more corruption on the bottom axis. On the other axis, we're measuring populism. We're measuring populism using the previous indicators I have, those country-level kinds of averages, for a data set that's about 10 years older. I look at this and see there's a very strong relationship here. Now, it's not a linear one, but it's telling me corruption seems to be an important, necessary condition for the highest levels of populism. So, again, we already know why that is. Corruption is telling us repeatedly every day to most citizens, this government treats you like something less. than the citizen. There are others who enjoy privileges that you don't. They have access to state resources that you don't. That's a very difficult message to swallow, and so people in those countries routinely vote for very radical populists. So getting rid of corruption, strengthening the state, not only is going to solve a number of economic problems, but it's also ultimately your best antidote to populism. And so if you ask me, well, what would we need to do in Mexico? Could we have a populist in Mexico? I would say, first of all, you almost did already. I don't know how you feel about AMLO, but in 2006, he was very populist. We actually spent time, by the way, coding the campaign speeches. And it was fascinating to watch after the election results were announced, when he became very angry, the demonstrations began in the Zocalo. We continued to code his speeches. And he just shot through the roof. Very populist. So you could have one. You could have a Hugo Chavez in the presidency of Mexico, changing the constitution, reforming the government. What keeps you from that? Well, it would be good to acknowledge the complaints of those who have been left behind by things like globalization, the poor who feel like they're not full citizens. But ultimately, in Mexico, as in other countries that struggle with the rule of law, state reform is absolutely essential. Until you get rid of that, there will be strong demand for populists. But you're part of the elite. You have the potential to change this. Good luck.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Very thought-provoking kind of policy implications and suggestions at the end. I propose that we open the floor for about 15-ish minutes. If there are any questions, I'll go around with a microphone. Any questions?
Voy a hacer la pregunta en español. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Tengo una pregunta con respecto a cómo mides populismo y si nos ayuda a explicar a Trump ahora en Estados Unidos. Porque la medida se basa en el discurso y en lo que dicen, es decir, estrictamente como tú dices, en las palabras, pero el significado muchas veces está, el mensaje, digamos, que quieren mandar, y en particular en los Estados Unidos me parece, está cifrado, ¿no? Porque hay algunas palabras que no se dicen, y entonces dices algunas cosas cuando en realidad quieres decir otras, y eso se entiende entre el candidato y el votante. Y acá estoy pensando en esta explicación de la cuestión racista en Estados Unidos, y no solamente con los afroamericanos, sino en general con los no blancos, ¿no? Y por ejemplo, ahora en el documental que es muy famoso, que cuentan cómo hay ciertas palabras que se usan de un modo y que todo el mundo no quieren decir lo que digamos textualmente dice la palabra, sino otra cosa que es sobreentendida entre el candidato y los votantes. Entonces no sé qué tienes que decir sobre eso, o sea, si esta medida basada en el speech capta este tipo de sutileza, y en particular en el caso de Estados Unidos. Y la otra es con respecto a lo del qué tanto este discurso populista aumenta el que los votantes vayan a votar, ¿no? Que aumenta el número de gente que va a votar, el turnout. Y justo ayer y antier salió en el Monkey Cage este artículo, es un texto de un profesor de Stanford, el que hace cosas de geolocalización, de Roden, exacto, de Jonathan Roden, en donde decía que parte de lo que, o sea, que parte de lo que explica el triunfo de Trump es que hubo los votantes a los que Hillary trató de apelar salieron a votar menos, pero aquellos a los que Trump apeló salieron a votar mucho más. O sea, es cierto que Trump ganó menos votos que Mitt Romney, pero mucha más gente salió a votar, especialmente en aquellas áreas que no son urbanas, no necesariamente las grandes ciudades, incluso ciudades, sino zonas urbanas en lugares como Utah y otros estados que son primordialmente rurales.
Yeah, let's take just a couple and then I can answer.
Okay. No, great. Thanks very much for the talk. I'm going to ask in English. Going back to your causes, the issues of economic dislocation, economic job loss due to globalization, and the issues of effects of immigrants and so forth. Now, you present this as though these are value-free, neutral, objective, and exogenous facts, that these things actually do exist and that they do have a real impact on people's lives, which people don't doubt. But my question to you is whether you think, or if there's any research been done, or whether you might move in this direction, how much of the populist discourse is trying to socially construct a fear among voters that would lead them to think that these effects are actually worse than they are, if you know what I mean. This is a tactic that has been used in other places at other times. Even in an environment in which facts are accepted as evidence, which isn't the case now in much of populist circles, you could see an effect that would be very, very striking of the fear being a fear of terrorism, of immigrants and loss of social identity or status and of economic opportunity, of these fears being exacerbated, of being constructed, of being worsened through the populist discourse. And if you're doing data analysis on the discourse, on the speeches of populists, you'd have a chance really to measure the distance between what they say and what the facts actually show you.
Okay, let me answer those. So going back to measurement, I was excited, hoping you wanted to hear a long talk about how we measure populism, how we do these textual analyses, because this is one of the areas I first started my work in, and I love this. But I don't think you want to hear the technical details of it right now. It's not really the plea that I heard from you. Instead, you're raising this issue. Now, the phrase in English, right, the phrase they'll use for this is dog whistle politics. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to give a little caution first, because the way I've seen the concept of dog whistle politics brought out as a critique of Trump, this is this is stepping back as a social scientist, saying, I don't think the people making the critique realize what they're doing. I think they're starting to fall into this populist dynamic of polarization, where you start to demonize each other. Again, I saw it in Venezuela for 15 years, and it was very sad to witness how people would close off and demonize and not speak to each other again, and would look for the absolute worst in the other side. So an example of this with Trump is I have a good friend, I'll call him very progressive in his own outlook. As we've talked about Trump and what this means, he doesn't live in the U.S., he's a scholar in Europe. And he sent me several emails at the time of Trump's inaugural address, insisting that the inaugural address showed that Trump was anti-Semitic just like Hitler. And he just affirmed this, the phrase America First. Don't you know that phrase comes from the interwar movement in the United States, the isolationist movement, some members of which were very anti-Semitic. Trump is like Hitler. And what I had to tell him was, Trump's daughter is Jewish. She's a convert to Judaism, and his son-in-law was born and raised Jewish. They send their children to a Jewish school. Are you sure he's anti-Semitic, just like Hitler? And instead, what I see as I read that in other accounts, the analyses that my friend sent me, was I thought, This is a lot of very scared, paranoid people. And now, that's not to say, though, that, especially in the case of racism, my sense is that, yeah, I mean, there's some of this going on in Trump's discourse, and that worries me a great deal. But I think there's a tendency to pile on, to assume other bad things about it, too. And so I would caution you as scholars, do your absolute best to maintain your objectivity. It is very tempting to let go of that in a situation like this. Now, as far as our method goes, I will say a little bit about the technical qualities of it. What we do here is not a traditional content analysis that goes word by word or sentence by sentence. Instead, it's called holistic grading. You read the whole text in its entirety and you look for a theme, and you compare the text then to a set of reference texts or anchor texts. So the reference text in this case, we do all the training in English, so we have to find texts that were spoken or have good translations in English. And we take them from a variety of leaders, Evo Morales, Robert Mugabe. We take some in-between examples, people like Stephen Harper in Canada. We take some that are not populist, Tony Blair, for example. And so those are the points of comparison. They come from a wide variety of environments and cultures. And we're instead focusing on these themes that I talked about in the definition. How do they understand the people? Do they understand the people as sort of a narrow, morally homogenous group? Do they have references to an evil elite? How do they bring this together? So it's sort of a whole package of ideas that we look for. And with populism, it seems the most sensible and valid approach to get at this. Now, what that means in practice is we're never going to look for something as specific as are there dog whistle kinds of references to racism in the speech. So we don't go down to that word-based level. We could. When I mentioned, for example, that we are pretty sure Trump's speechwriters are the ones bringing in most of the populism. We know that because of a word-based analysis that we did. So, by the way, what we did was we looked at his speeches, and we measured the number of words per sentence and the length of words in his speeches, because a speechwriter's speech has longer sentences and more sophisticated words than Trump's own language, which is pretty informal. We also looked for the number of references to the word great. It's one of Trump's favorite words, huge, great. So we looked at great. And we found this tremendous difference between speeches if we took high populist speeches and low populist speeches. The high populist speeches were ones that had much longer words and sentences and did not use the word great. They're probably being written by speechwriters. So an interesting thing. But for the most part, the measures are looking at the whole text. So it has its advantages. It gives quick and I think a really satisfying, valid read of the level of populism in it. Another thing to remember is that there will always be those differences in text, but when we're doing these cross-national analyses, you should say, oh, wait, they're probably missing some of those subtle cues in the Spanish speeches as well. So I think if to the degree that there's measurement error and then we're maybe not picking up on something, we try to pick up on it by having native speakers of the language. So we have Spaniards reading the Spanish speeches. And we hope that gets around a lot of that. But measurement error, there may be a little, but I think I'm hoping it's consistent across the board. That was one question. Now, the other one, how this affects turnout differentially. My guess is yes. Now, the theory we have here right now talks a lot about essentially who they're targeting, and the sense that traditionally right populists, both in Latin America and in Europe, and previous right populists in the U.S., like Ross Perot, were actually not aiming very deep with their rhetoric. So they would kind of aim for middle class votes, and those people were already voting. And I don't know, the turnout changed a lot. With Trump, again, what we're seeing is, on average, there's no change, but there's a shift in who those voters are. So clearly, so he lost the vote of people like me, but he gained the vote of someone else, maybe who's working in some Rust Belt city and lost his job, and who wasn't voting before. So on average, we still see this effect, and on average, we see the left populists manage to activate many more people than even someone like Trump has done. And so to put that in perspective, imagine this. Imagine if Trump had not only got poor white voters to vote, but also poor black and Hispanic voters to vote. That's almost inconceivable. But if he were Hugo Chavez, he would have done that. He would have had a broader appeal, and I think he would have seen turnout actually go up a lot more. Yeah. Okay. As far as is populism, are the threats that populists evoke and respond to, are they maybe a little constructed? And our answer is yes. So I talked about other factors besides corruption and sorts of deep, awful policy failures. And one of the other factors is you do need to have someone come along and speak some populism to you. So what that's doing, when Trump or Chavez does that, is they're saying, you're suffering right now, the reason you're suffering is this. So they're making an interpretive move. And that's what we also, in other literatures, we call framing. So the populist argument, that rhetoric, is performing a very important function. It's getting you, the voter, to reinterpret your reality. So now, to what degree does this sort of sharpen your sense of crisis and turn it into something bigger and maybe even qualitatively different? We can't get at that right now with the analyses that we have. The best way we do this is not at all actually through textual analysis, but framing effects are studied these days quite a bit through experimental research. So we'll do kinds of communication studies to see if I bring this frame in versus that frame, does that activate people's attitudes? That's not a full answer like you're talking about, because I still can't look inside their heads and see if they've now begun to reinterpret the threat and see it somehow in a very different way. So I can't put my finger on that exactly. But the experiments right now, I think, are one of the most interesting ways of getting at it. And they're showing that the framing matters a lot.
Pertinent questions, I think we're going to close it off here. Thank you very much, Dr. Hawkins, for enlightening us in some of the thought-provoking examples and policy implications. And thank you very much for joining us here. And I hope you all have a very nice afternoon. Thank you.